Okay, so we will start. It's too bad we missed last class because of the snowstorm. Um, we definitely have to figure out how we're going to get to work. I say just bring it in next week to class. Okay, so today's lesson is on conducting a biopsychosocial as well as a mental status exam. I will be giving you worksheets next week when we see each other, uh, basically so that when you're conducting a psychosocial, you know what to do. All right. So the the way I do this is I basically go through the major domains that you're going to ask questions on, and and the content that's there. So one of the first things you're going to get is their personal information. Now, if you feel like time is like pressured, you could probably get that off of that pre-screening instrument that you would have already conducted or someone from the agency would have conducted. But let's say someone comes into private practice, you're going to ask them, well, what's your name? Do you have any nicknames? Sometimes people, for whatever reason, will want to go by a nickname. One of the common ways is if they feel like it's hard to pronounce their name, they'll say, just call me dot, 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 right? Um, I like to ask them how to say it and hear it again and again and again because I think that people should be called by their name. But sometimes people think it's easier just call a nickname. You want to get their age, date of birth, their race and ethnicity. These are all demographics information, but it helps you get a better picture of who they are and what they're going through. As you may recall, in one of our first lessons, we talked about diversity factors, and racial and ethnic minorities will come in with potentially with unique struggles that other people may not even know. So you want to get that. And then the chief complaint is like, well, what led you to come to this facility or what brought you in today? That's a good question. The chief complaint you want to spend a lot of time with, particularly new clinicians. They want to get through a series of questions and they rush it, and then they don't build a rapport with the client. Allow the client to talk about their pain for a decent amount of time. I let them talk about it for as long as they can go. So things like whatchamacallit, things like oh yeah, I was abused, I became depressed, I had panic attacks. Let them just go, and when they stop, then you could go on. But if you need to ask questions, anchor questions like when did it start, how has it impacted your ability to function, these kind of questions are going to help you formulate a diagnosis. And I know in a previous video I talked about that as well. So how's it impacted your ability to function? You want to ask them, have you ever went for psychological services in the past, or mental health services? That's important. Um, you want to ask them, if they say yes, tell me more about it. You want to ask them where it was. You may even want to get a release of information to look at that record. So this is important. You may want to ask if they've ever been hospitalized. That's also important. And if so, when, how, why. Okay, so that's the chief complaint. You want to sit with that. And ultimately, the chief complaint is why they say they're coming in for therapy. And I tell you that when we say chief complaint, many times the reason why they say they're coming is not the real reason, but they don't trust you yet. And until they establish that trust, they're not gonna be honest with you. Okay. Family psychiatric history. We know a lot of conditions run in families. So you want to ask, does your family have a history of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, schizophrenia, psychosis? These kind of questions. And if they say yes, then you ask them, well, what relative? And you ask them what the outcome was and all of these things. But the family psychiatric history will be important. Your home life. I spend a lot of time trying to understand early childhood development. And I'm a CBT therapist, so my focus is cognitive behavioral therapy. But I recognize that early development plays a major role in how people feel and see themselves. So I asked them, where were you born? And many times people move. So if they weren't born and raised in wherever they say, you might ask, well, how did you get here? Now, that's a great question, particularly if you have a person who's immigrated from another country. They will share some really horrific things that they may have needed to do in order to get here. So you may want to ask, well, how did you get here? And some people will take it very literally. They'll be like, what do you mean? We drove. And then you might be like, well, no, what was involved in the decision of coming to New York or New York City? That's helpful. You want to ask them where they live, who lives in the home with you. That's important because you're going to know who their support and potentially who their stressors are. And how old were you when you left the home? A lot of childhood conflict can be revealed if a person says, yeah, I left home at 16. You'd be like, wow, 16 years old. That's pretty early. Well, what happened? Right? And you just reflect it back and try and get more information. Your next thing you're going to ask is like about brothers, sisters, siblings. How many brothers, sisters do you have? What are their names and ages? Sometimes I skip that question. I don't always think it's necessary. What's their occupation? That's helpful to know. Are they healthy and how do you get along with them? Right? So then you could see how they resolve conflict in a household. Then you ask about the parents. What are your parents' names? Are they still alive? Right? Are they married, divorced, separated, widowed? Right? These kind of questions. Are they healthy? What do they do for a living? How do you get along with your parents? Right? That's an important question. Now, here we start to assess them for abuse, right? And high risk. So we start to ask about, was there physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence? These kind of questions are important. And I like to finish it off by asking a catch-all question. Is there anything that you would like to change about your family? Right? Anything you would like to change? And you would be amazed at what you get when you ask these kind of like questions that are more ambiguous. People would say, yeah, I wish I was raised by my grandmother because she was much nicer than my parents. And you start to see these like relationships. So from the home life, we start to look at their education. I like to put some questions starting in early development because some of you will work with kids. So you might ask, well, what's the highest grade you completed? How old were you when you finished school? What do you like best about school, least about school? Have you been suspended or expelled? Again, this will tap into the potential for oppositional defiance and conduct disorder, learning disabilities. So when you're asking the biopsychosocial, you're really trying to screen them for disorders as well. So this will tap into that. Have you ever been suspended or expelled? Did you graduate high school? Did you get a GED? Now, these you ask everyone, depending on the age, right? If they're in fourth grade, you know they didn't graduate high school, so don't ask it. Adults, you're going to continue and you're going to say, well, did you go to college? What was your GPA? What was your major? Any additional schooling or non-academic training like a trade school, right? Some people may say, yeah, I went to school to become an electrical engineer or a plumber or whatever. That's helpful information to know how they're making a living. And from the education, we switch over to occupation, right? Are you currently employed? If they say yes, you ask them to tell you about it. If they say no, then you ask, well, what was your most recent job? How long did you work there? What was the reason why you left? And then you want to ask, well, did you work anywhere before that job to sort of get an idea of work history? Major gaps in work history are significant. They could reveal personality disorders. They could reveal that a person cannot work well with others, they don't play nice. It could also reveal some kind of social problem like socialization, social anxiety, and then being unemployed or underemployed is a very, very strong risk factor for mental health problems. So it also reveals their financial situation. Then we ask about their mood, right? So things like depression and suicide. Now you could use this for the mood and affect piece of the mental status exam. I'm not sure if I defined it, but I'll define it now. Mood is, how are you feeling? So if you ask them, how are you feeling? That would be mood. Affect is how they look like they're feeling, right? So a person may say, I'm fine, but they might appear depressed. You might say, patient reported feeling fine. Affect appeared depressed, or mood was inconsistent with affect. You could say any one of these things. And we really want to ask them about suicide and things like that. So we're going to ask them about sleep problems, hopelessness, helplessness, risk factors for depression. Did you ever want to harm yourself? Have you ever thought life is not worth living? Now, if they say yes to this question, do not freak out, because many people will have that experience from time to time. So they may say yes to you, and it means very little. And this is what we call passive suicidal ideations, right? It's passive suicidal ideations. I'm sure some of you watching the video, you too may have at one point or another felt like life was not worth living. But we fight on, right? Then we start to ask, well, okay, if you thought about that you wanted to do harm to yourself, well, have you ever done that? Have you ever thought about killing yourself? Have you intentionally hurt yourself through cutting or falling or taking pills or whatever it is? Have you ever attempted suicide? Now, what's the difference between asking a person if they've intentionally hurt themselves or attempted suicide? There are a lot of people who will do what's called parasuicidal actions like cutting, and that is associated with trauma many times, personality disorders, and so forth. So you want to get information because that will flag you for the trauma. You might ask, have you ever committed or attempted to commit suicide? If yes, how, when, what was the result? That's not on the slide, but you want to know what was the result. So someone will say, yeah, I took 20 pills, but someone found me passed out and they brought me to the emergency room. So you want to know what happened. Eating habits. This is good to assess whether a person has anorexia, bulimia, body dysmorphic disorder, right? So you're going to ask them questions like, what do you like and what don't you like about your body? And it's an awkward question, but we ask it. Have you had any recent changes in your weight? Now, weight fluctuates as a function of anxiety and depression. In fact, if there is a marked change in weight, that's one of the criteria for depression. Do you ever feel like your eating is out of control, right? So people might binge eat. Have you ever dieted in the past year? If so, how, right? So now we're trying to assess binge eating disorder from, let's say, anorexia or bulimia, right? Have you ever made yourself throw up to control your weight, right? Anorexia, obviously. How much do you exercise on an average day or week? This is important. If a person says they exercise an hour a day, that's fine. If a person says, I spend 3 to 4 hours in the gym a day, that's an alarm, because unless you're training for a marathon or you're training for a fitness competition, it's a problem. You shouldn't be spending that much time. People, for a healthy heart, it's, according to the American Heart Association, 30 minutes a day for 3 days per week. So as long as you do that, you're fine. Now, I know that for kids, we say 60 minutes a day because we want to combat the obesity epidemic. Okay. Now, legal history. This is important. You want to assess whether they have any legal problems. This will be very common amongst people with substance use disorder and antisocial personality disorder. So, I don't know if you're seeing a theme, but these questions aren't just questions. These questions are doing an assessment to come to a diagnosis. And you're getting a full picture of the individual's life. So you're going through every domain of their life, everywhere there could be dysfunction, and you want to get questions about it. So you might ask them, have you ever gotten in trouble with the law? If so, what happened? Were you charged, right? Were you convicted? Do you belong to any special groups or gangs, right? These kind of things. Drugs and alcohol, substance use disorders. This is what we're tapping into. Have you ever experimented with alcohol? What age did you start? How often do you drink? Right? Do your friends drive when you've been drinking? These are all alcohol questions. Now, we start with alcohol as opposed to other drugs because alcohol usually starts first and then other drugs follow. And then you might say, well, have you ever experimented with other drugs? And that's a follow-up, right? What age did it start? Have you ever been in a serious car accident or trouble with the law in regard to your drug or alcohol use? Were they related to your drinking and use of drugs? Do your family members drink, smoke, or use other drugs? Now, asking that family question is important because the research suggests that there's a transgenerational effect of substance abuse. So it runs in families. So you want to tap into that. If so, how do you feel about that? Is that a problem for you? Someone may say, yeah, I used to drink. I've been in recovery for 9 years, but my brother, sister, mother, father, they still drink and it bothers me and it makes me uncomfortable being around them. Sexuality. Before you ask any question about sex, I always recommend doing a disclaimer. You tell them in the beginning you're doing a series of questions to get a better understanding of who they are. And some of the questions are going to be more uncomfortable than others. And this domain for some may be uncomfortable, but it's just to get a better understanding of who you are. So I apologize if it makes you uncomfortable. And if there are any questions you don't want to answer, please just tell me you don't want to answer them. I say that before I even ask any questions. So then I ask, have you ever been in a relationship? Have you had sex? Because there are a lot of people in relationships, but they don't have sex, particularly younger kids. How old? If they say yes, they had sex, you might say, how old were you when you first had sex? How many same-sex? Have you ever had any same-sex partners? Right? Because again, diversity factors. You're tapping into LGBT, and people may want an ally. They may want someone who's going to be supportive and help them either come out or help them explore their sexuality, or they may just want to talk about these issues. So you want to give them a forum. You're going to ask them how many sex partners they had, because hypersexuality is associated with being manic, so bipolar. Hypersexuality is associated with substance abuse. Hypersexuality is associated with personality disorders. So asking about this is important. And then you want to look at the impact of sex or things that people may or may not have different values on. Do you use contraception? Well, if you don't use contraception, you're at risk of a pregnancy, these things, right? These kind of questions. STDs. Have you ever been tested for an STD? If they say yes, what were your results? Have you ever been unfaithful to your partner? Because this goes back to trust. That's a big deal. And we could talk about that. Now, so far, we've been asking them questions about their life, getting a big picture of who they are. But we haven't focused in on some of their strengths and some of the things that may be useful in therapy. And this series of questions or activities is so important because people sometimes forget to ask, do you have a lot of friends? If they say no, does that bother you? They may say no. Okay, that's good. If they say yes, we may talk about social skills, right? Are your friends the same age as you? What does it mean if a person is with a lot of friends that are older? Well, they're going to be at risk of doing activities or behaviors that are for older people. So they may not have matured, and then all of a sudden they're doing things like starting having sex at 11 because they're hanging out with 16-year-olds, and there's a difference there. Okay, are you males? Are your friends more likely to be male or female? What are they? This basically tells you about comfort level in friendships. Hobbies. I love asking a question about hobbies because then if we need to talk about something in therapy, or I can bring something in to build rapport, hobbies are useful. When a person's really depressed, hobbies are useful to encourage them, right? Do you play any sports? Do you have a religious affiliation? If you do have a religious affiliation, does it help you with coping, right? Religious coping buffers against mental illness. So knowing that is important. If they say no or it doesn't help, then you don't bring religion into the therapy room. Okay. Do you read for fun? What kind of things do you read? Do you listen to music? What kind of music do you listen to? How much TV do you watch? What are your favorite television shows? Now, excessive television watching is a problem, right? Now, you may want to change this to screen time. How much time do you spend on your phone, tablet, etc.? People spend a lot of time checking out, right? Now, a little bit of time is good. Spending too much time could be problematic. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears to the mental status exam, and I apologize that I'm talking faster, but I know that my recording can give me problems if I record too long and try and upload it on YouTube. Okay, so mental status exam. Let me say the things that aren't here yet, right? So the first thing you want to look at is their appearance. Are they dressed appropriately? What does their hygiene look like? Do they look their stated age? What does their walk look like? Are they walking kind of funny, right? So being unkempt, their hygiene being poor, may indicate a psychotic disorder, may indicate dementia. Walking with funny gait also indicates dementia potentially. Okay, so you want to look at their appearance. Mood and affect we already got to. That's important. Then we want to start to look at motor activities. Do they look fidgety? Or do they report being fidgety? Have you ever been more active than usual? Well, that might be ADHD, right? Have you been less active than usual? Lethargic, that might be depression. So you want to tap into their motor activity, and you want to watch it. You want to watch how they move. Are they moving with a normal speed, or are they just dragging their body and shuffling? That could be useful information. Now, their speech, you want to pay attention to the kinds of words they use. You want to pay attention to whether or not they use bizarre words. That may be important for thought content. You want to pay attention to the rate of speech, right? If they are blah, 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 and they're speaking so fast, they could be hypomanic. That's a sign. You may want to also see if there's any kind of language-based disorder. So we ask them to pronounce a word that kind of is hard for many people if they have a language disorder. We ask them to say, can you say Methodist Episcopalian, right? A hard series of words, easy to get stuff tripped up on. Then we go into perceptual disorders. We're tapping into either delusional disorder, psychotic disorder, schizophrenia. So we ask, do you ever see things or hear voices? Right? Now, auditory visual hallucinations, that's what we're tapping into. Do you ever have strange experiences as you fall asleep or wake up? So night terrors, delirium, right? These kind of things. You ever have strange smells, right? So olfactory hallucinations. Then we talk about thought content. This is usually the paranoia or, delusional thought content. So we ask question, Do you ever feel that people want to harm you, right? Now, it's only paranoia if it's not true. If there are people out to get them, then take it with a grain of salt. Do you have any special powers? If yes, then what are they? Is there anyone trying to influence you, right? Feeling like we're being manipulated by Big Brother or whatever. Are there any thoughts that you can't get out of your head? Now, this could be delusional thought content. This could be OCD because people have obsessive thoughts. Do you ever think of the end of the world? Can people read your mind? Do you ever feel like the TV is talking to you? These are classic psychotic features. And that is your mental status exam. So let me just go through it. You're going to assess their appearance, mood, affect, their speech, perceptual disorders, right? And then thought content. And that's that. And that is our lecture. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Don't forget to bring in your first assignment that was due actually last week, but we didn't have class because of the snowstorm. All right, so I'll see you then.